Hello! Welcome back to the fifth and final installment of our adult forum series entitled 5 Famous Philosophers Who Influenced Our Faith. Today's philosopher is the last we'll be covering in this series, and he is also the only one who lived after Martin Luther, and thus didn't have a direct impact on the theology of Luther himself. Kant did, however, have a significant impact on the theology of Lutherans in the centuries after his life, as we will see here today. And he's certainly worthy of being called a famous philosopher, as his thought is often seen as the pinnacle of the Age of Enlightenment. According to Kant himself, the Age of Enlightenment was primarily marked by the growth of secularism and a turning away from organized religion. While this is true, I'd suggest that the growth of secularism was more of a side effect to the more important focus on reason and the use of our senses and empirical evidence to come to conclusions about all sorts of things, including philosophical truths. It is here that the ideas of Aristotle finally reach their height as the scientific method begins to develop and our assumption that observing the world allows us to understand it becomes ingrained in our collective culture. The Enlightenment's focus on reason, personal freedom, and individual community progress certainly did have a major impact on the church, and Kant played a big role in how that impact was made. Kant grew up as the child of Pietists, which was a movement within Lutheranism that emphasized holy living and the process of sanctification. While he eventually rejected religion outwardly, it is clear that Kant was deeply influenced by his upbringing, and he may not have strayed quite as far from his childhood beliefs as he may have thought, or so claim his many secular critics. Before we jump into some commentary on some of Kant's ideas and how they have influenced Christianity and our American culture today, you'll want to pause this video and take a look at today's introduction to Kant. I am grateful that we can return to the School of Life series after missing our video on Thomas Aquinas last week. Please click the link in the description below to view this introduction. Then return here for some of my reflections on Kant. Thinking about the influence of Immanuel Kant is certainly different than thinking about the other philosophers we've engaged in our series so far. Because he lived so much later in history than the others, and because he lived after Martin Luther, the way we think about his influence has to change. Rather than being an influence on Martin Luther, we need to consider the ways in which Martin Luther was an influence on Kant. One interesting thought I'd like to share relates to Kant's upbringing. As I mentioned earlier, Kant was raised in a sub-movement of Lutheranism called Pietism, a movement in which members were expected to focus on their own personal piety, or spiritual growth and spiritual practices. The intention of Pietism, at least on its face, is sanctification, the process of being sanctified, being made more holy, bettering oneself toward becoming who God intends for you to be. The very idea that a person could work towards sanctification would have been repugnant to Luther, who had one of the lowest opinions of humanity of anyone in human history. Recalling our connection of Luther to Augustine and his focus on original sin, you can trace some evidence of a return to Luther by Kant in his idea of radical evil, the perversion of freedom toward immorality and away from the morality of reason. Unlike his parents, who were pietists, Kant did not believe that we were necessarily able to develop ourselves outside of some other kind of actor. Luther would call this the bondage of the will, our inability to choose to do anything good because of our sinful nature, and our complete reliance on God to free us from that sin so that we can even have the ability to choose the moral path. This reminds me once again of Paul's confusion in his letter to the Romans. He said, "I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do." Why are we torn in this way? Luther would say it's sin. Kant might use different language, but there is still evidence that he believed in a power in conflict with reason, perhaps passions, that prevent us from behaving the way we know we should. This leads us to another idea, that of Kant's belief in the power of art and beauty to direct us away from those passions or sins. If you remember back to our session on Plato, understood to be the first true philosopher because he wrote down his thoughts, you might recall that Plato believed that beauty teaches us moral lessons because it points us toward the perfection of various character traits, and motivates us to aspire to living out those traits more consistently and more fully. As the introductory video mentioned, Kant believed that the beauty of nature influences human universally and goads us toward becoming our best selves because it reminds us of our interconnectedness with all things. This is a beautiful idea, and it brings us up against the Reformation belief of sola scriptura. If we are to place our belief in Scripture alone, then what is the place of natural beauty and secular art? I would say that although Kant wouldn't use these terms, this doesn't seem to be at odds with Scripture as much as it complements it. This certainly reminds me of the many places in Scripture and my own life that have highlighted the presence and love of God using images of beauty in nature. God's footprint is present wherever we look, and that footprint inspires us, even if we don't have eyes to see that it is God doing the inspiring. The role of Scripture is to undergird the entire structure, not to replace it. One last item I'd like to take a look at is Kant's categorical imperative, which is basically a fancy way of attempting to restate the Golden Rule without claiming any sort of religious basis for it. The goal is to help us look at our behavior from the other side of the coin, and Kant would argue that you don't need Christianity to do that. But by relegating the categorical imperative to philosophy alone, we run the risk of turning it into a transactional idea rather than a transformational one. I'd suggest that the Bible actually holds us to a higher standard than the Golden Rule. Rather than do unto others as you would have others do to you, the Bible tells us, do unto others as Christ has done unto you. Kant claimed that we cannot argue for or against the existence of God by reason alone, and so in a sense, faith is literally unreasonable. But because of this, we can also ask if we ought to live in ways that are governed by reason alone. Should we live by reason alone? Perhaps we could ask, do we walk by faith or by sight? It's here on this cliffhanger that we close our series. Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, and Kant all raise questions for us, either reflected in Lutheran thought or pushing back against it. But as Luther himself once said, every person must do their own believing. I encourage you to consider some of the things that we've talked about in this series on all 5 of our philosophers. Maybe put something in the comments below to share with us, or put it on our Facebook page. Or if you'd like, you can send me an email. I'd love to interact with you on some of these ideas. The best thing we can do is to continue to talk together, continue to struggle with these questions, and continue to grow in our faith. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.